I'm Jona Piel and I work in the graphics team of Land Design Studio, and Land mostly designs exhibitions, museums, visitor centres, anything where a story is told in some sort of spatial context. And I initially studied visual communication in Hamburg, and already then I think I was quite interested in information graphics and how you convey narratives and information through graphics or visuals, and ended up being particularly interested in instruction manuals. I then worked for 3 years in Berlin at a design studio, very classic graphics, corporate communications, visual identities, a couple of school textbooks, a couple of wayfinding projects, but very much what you classically would do in a graphic design studio. And working on those wayfinding projects, I realized, well, actually they're a bit like instruction manuals, only taken into a three-dimensional realm. And so I got really interested in that and decided to go back to university and went to study creative practice for narrative environments, an MA course at Central St Martin's in London. So since then I'm designing anything that is two-dimensional in an exhibition, and that could range from the very mundane object label to an arrow on the wall pointing you towards the exit, to large-scale information graphics or graphic surfaces, or art directing software designers, interactive designers, to create their user interface to work with the rest of the graphics and graphics concepts for exhibitions. We always think that we don't have a style, which is due to the fact that actually every project is so content-led that it has to be completely different. But obviously within that complete difference between every project, there are certain similarities and objectives. You always want to help to tell the stories. We will always be the facilitators of the content. We're not there to add a layer of design to something. We are there to help the experts in their field to find the right way of telling their stories, to engage the audience and to excite people about their story. And that story could be as different as Baroque artifacts or music or penguins. So and if you look at that breadth of content, you already know that the way that these stories will be told, it has to be very different. It can't be the same approach. Generally, with each project, you start to look at, I don't know, what the storyline that the client already gives you, and depending who the client is, say someone like the Victoria and Albert Museum, who do a lot of exhibitions every year, they tend to have a very well prepared brief by the time they get us on board. So probably someone will have been working on it for 2 years already, and they'll have the objects pretty much lined up, and they'll have the storyline that they want to convey very clear in their head. So we start when there's already a big pool of content and objects and references to work with, and start our research. So with all of these things, naturally the situation of the project will provide you with a different entry point. So certain things will be in a way that they send you a complete object list. So you obviously start thinking about the project by looking at the objects and looking at the quality of the objects, and what, especially with the Golden Age of Couture that we did for the V&A, these were all 50s ball gowns and beautiful dresses. So you obviously have a very visual point of entry into the project, because you could look at the materials, you look at the way things were presented at that time, you look at magazines of that time, and you find a way into the story through the content. So from those objects that are so beautiful and evocative of a certain period, you then start thinking about what kind of design solutions you could develop to present these objects. And we try to use illustrations and a timeline to, for example, distinguish the objects in the case, so that we wouldn't have to number the dresses. We created little illustrations of the dresses and use those on object labels. The last room in this exhibition pretty much functions as a coda to the whole exhibition, because the exhibition itself is about the period from 1947 to 1957, and then the last room looks at the legacy of that period, so it looks at 50 years later. The dresses that are displayed in this last room are by John Galliano for Christian Dior, from a current day collection. So this whole room really looks at how everything that was shown in the 3 rooms before has impacted on what we perceive as fashion today. So it needed to feel very differently and needed to sum up the whole exhibition. So what we did was that, because the exhibition itself wasn't arranged chronologically but by themes, the dresses weren't actually arranged in a chronological order, and we gave every visitor on the gallery guide a small timeline that would locate every dress on its respective, sort of in its respective year and with its respective designer, so that people could find their way around and could actually look the dress that they were looking at, look it up on the gallery guide and know when it was designed. And then in the last room, that small timeline was revealed to be part of a much bigger timeline, a 13-meter long timeline actually, that charted the whole development of fashion houses in France and England between 1710 and 2005. So you got the whole context and you got the whole overview of which designer worked for which house and how did it all go together and how did they all end up doing what they did in this big overview. Every project that we do will have a curator from the museum or from the specifically for the exhibition, and they are the absolute experts in their field, so they are our source of knowledge. And with the timeline, that was something that initially wasn't in the brief of the exhibition, but that just came out through the process of working together, of trying to figure out what the best way of telling the story is, and which really came out of a series of creative meetings between us and the curators, and just thinking about what do we need for the last room, what can we have as a final statement there. We've got similar objectives for every project, and especially for graphics, that always includes being as accessible as possible, making sure that the graphics are legible, that we design in a way that the content is clear and well, open for everybody. It's not about trying to be elitist or obscure in our design. The aim always is to get the story across, because that's the reason of why people would go into an exhibition. So I think in a very basic breakdown, you might say that in some instances the graphics just take over the role of an additional layer of information visualization, an additional layer of storytelling in something that would be more information graphics than anything else. And in another project, the graphics might take up the role of adding atmosphere to something, which probably was most the case in the British music experience. And then in other cases, graphics might suddenly be more something that you would call decoration, where you start off with the content, obviously, and decoration has a slightly weird ring to it, and I don't mean it in a negative way of it being not tied very closely to the content, but you might start with a certain aspect of the content, which in this exhibition we did for Tokyo, which was in the Science Museum in Tokyo. It was about medical futures, and we had all these DNA arrays, and a really big part of that exhibition was about the advantages that are made through science and DNA profiling and personalized medicine and all these things that will come in the future. And we looked at an awful lot of very sort of beautiful scientific images, and they all had this dot pattern on it, and suddenly the dot pattern and the way that genes are mapped out became a really interesting starting point to develop a graphic concept for this. So we developed a graphic concept that was based on dots, which at first are really chaotic, and then through the order and systematic approach of science suddenly all fall into place and become a grid and then resemble the DNA array. We then really explored that grid and dot pattern and said, right, the grid should rule everything, and the grid should determine where the screws get put in the walls. The grid then becomes a typographic grid, and it becomes layout for the whole wall, and everything follows from that, which you can't always do, because sometimes a spatial situation will be so complex that you would be shooting yourself in the foot by saying everything needs to follow a certain grid pattern. But in this case it worked really well, and the walls were in a controllable size, and it was the right thing to do. But sometimes you try something and then it doesn't, you think, oh, it'd be good to have a really strong grid, and then after a couple of months in the project you think, yeah, it was a really good idea, but actually this is not going to work. We need to make sure that we make the system work for us rather than the other way around. The way that our work is divided up follows the architectural stages. So we do concept design, and then scheme design, and then detail design, and then artwork, and then production. And between those might easily be 3 or 4 months. So when you do a concept, you present an idea, and you present how that idea could be carried across a whole exhibition, how we could extract all the elements from this one idea to work over a large number of graphic items, if you will. And then you just start exploring that concept, and you have to make sure that the concept that you come up with is not just good enough for one poster or one title cover or something. You need to make sure that this concept is solid enough that you can do 500 pieces of graphics with it without any one of them being boring, but also that enables you to set up certain rules and generic things, that you don't have to come up with a new design for every single one of those 500 items. You need to set up your idea and then develop a system from that, and then that system in a way gets rolled out, and you have to define the rules and the parameters of this system so well that you can then, if they 2 days before the opening say, oh yeah, and we need another panel that goes here and does this, you immediately will know how it will look like, how it has to look like. Ice Station Antarctica was a touring exhibition starting at the Natural History Museum in London, which would then afterwards go tour around the world to various venues. That at the point where we were at that moment, we didn't know which venues that would be. So we were designing for something, for a gallery in the Natural History Museum, but then also for an unknown number of unknown spaces in other countries. And the exhibition was geared at 7 to 11-year-olds, and the objective was to excite children about Antarctica, and by way of exciting them about Antarctica also raising awareness of how much we need to protect this special place in terms of environmental issues and impact in the future and so on. And we developed this idea of it being a boot camp, training camp for ice cadets. So the whole thing was set up as this fictitious training camp that the museum visitor would go to, and they would get a briefing, and they would go through a couple of challenges that they had to test how good they were at deep sea diving, and they had to see whether they could stand working with smelly penguins, or whether they could survive the stink of penguin vomit, and all these kind of things. And in the end, you'd then be the ice cadet, and you would find out whether you'd be suited to be a pilot in Antarctica, or whether you'd be really good as a deep-sea diver. Effectively, it developed a visual identity that would then influence the exhibition graphics and get disseminated through everything two-dimensional that we needed in the exhibition. So that was really very much like you would start developing a visual identity for anything else. We started looking at a potential logo, we looked at typefaces, at the colour palette, because we knew that the exhibition was going to tour and going to be translated in different languages. We wanted to have something that doesn't rely only on words. We wanted to have a visual language that is quite fun and rich in all its non-verbal elements. So we designed about 100 pictograms to be used then on maps and illustrations and diagrams such as food chains, so that we get this really rich palette of visual elements that we can use, and it wouldn't matter whether it would get translated and we then didn't have any control over how the artwork would look somewhere else, but we still had all these components to make it still look like a very rounded, visual concept. So we designed all sorts of pictograms, which was really nice, and I got to design a pictogram of a vomiting penguin, because that was to be used in the Vomit Interactive, where children would sift through artificial penguin vomit and see what the penguins had eaten, because it's a very, very important part of a scientist's work in Antarctica to look at penguin vomit, because that gives them a lot of information about what the penguins had eaten and how the ecosystem sea is balanced, therefore whether there's a lot of krill in there or little fish or not a lot of krill. You need to present something that is quite clearly a sketch, and then you can discuss it as a sketch, because you want to, at that point, you want any discussion or debate that you want to trigger needs to be on a level where it's not really about what size is that line going to be, but it needs to be about, do we want something that is based on a certain treatment of photographs, or do we want something that is based on it all being blue? So you want to talk about the concept at that moment, you don't want to talk about the exact execution. And then once you've agreed on the concept, then you'll say, right, we'll work a couple of things up on this and make it a bit more solid and test whether this works. So you have the concept, and then you try out whether you can actually possibly do 500 pieces of graphics that still look interesting with this. And then, so you develop from one step to the next, and then at some point you'll get some real text and you'll get some real images, and then you might have to adjust your concept, because actually what you thought would work really well doesn't work that well, because you've got twice as much text or twice as many images, and then you amend and tweak and go back and forth, and the client is always involved in that, so it's very much an iterative process. It's not like you get the brief and then 1.5 years later you deliver the exhibition. Throughout, it's something that everybody feels part of, and that in the end that's the most important and most exciting thing, that you create something that everybody feels a great deal of ownership about. You get the client to say, this is our exhibition, and it's not just something that we thought as designer would look nice in this space, it's something that we help them to tell, and I think that's what makes it very rewarding as well, that you get people who really like what you've created with them and for them.